In the late autumn of 1887, in the high desert country south of Cheyenne, a battered freight car sat at the end of a gravel spur line where no train had run in 6 years. The spur had been laid by the Continental Overland Railway Company to service a water pumping station that never opened, and when the company folded its western operations and retreated east, the car was left behind as a kind of punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one had finished writing. By the time Nora Vane arrived in the settlement of Chalk Ford, the freight car had become local furniture. Children dared each other to approach it. Old men on the mercantile porch pointed to it when they wanted to indicate how long something had been going wrong in Chalk Ford, which was longer than most people cared to count. Nora was 28 years old and had arrived in Chalk Ford with $41, a leather roll of coopering tools her father had left her, and no particular plan beyond finding steady work. She was not from Wyoming. She had grown up in eastern Ohio along the river towns where her father had operated a small cooperative, making and repairing barrels for the grain and apple operations that lined the valley. He had died the previous winter of a chest ailment that took him quickly, and the cooperative had passed to a creditor before the ground thawed. Nora had no brothers. The creditor had been polite about it. She had taken the tool roll, the $41, and a westbound ticket, because west was where work was said to be, and she had gotten off at Chalk Ford because the train had stopped there, and a woman at the station had mentioned that the settlement's only provisioner needed help with his stock. The provisioner's name was Arlen Webb. He had needed help in the way a man needs help who does not actually want it. And within 2 weeks, Nora understood that the position had been described to the station woman charitably. She restocked his shelves with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing an inventory of parts. She swept and tallied and kept his figures cleaner than they had been in years, and Webb paid her adequately while making clear that he considered her presence a temporary arrangement. It was Webb who told her one November morning when she asked about the freight car at the end of the spur that no one owned it. The Continental Overland Railway had been dissolved by court order in 1883. Its assets had been distributed among creditors, but the spur line and the car on it had been logged as a liability rather than an asset, and liabilities had a way of getting lost in the accounting of a failed railroad. "You could buy it at the county tax auction," Webb said, not looking up from his ledger, "if you had a reason to want a broke-down freight car." She asked when the auction was. He told her, in the same flat voice, that it was the following Tuesday, and that the minimum bid on the spur property was $3.50, and that she would be bidding against no one because there was nothing to bid on. If you have ever watched someone spend money they cannot easily spare on something the room has already decided is worthless, you know the particular quality of silence that settles over the proceedings. The auction in Chalk Ford's small county annex attracted 7 men who had come for the sale of a disputed pasture parcel on the North Road, and they stayed, mildly curious, when Nora placed her bid on the spur property. The auctioneer, a man named Coble, read the description of the property with the weary precision of a man performing a ritual he expected to finish in seconds. No counterbid came. He stamped the paper. $3.50. One of the men near the back made a remark about the freight car that drew a brief laugh from the others. Coble did not laugh. He handed Nora her receipt with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to comment on what people chose to purchase, and she folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She owned an abandoned freight car. Her father had told her many things about wood and iron, and the way sealed containers held what was put inside them. He had been a quiet man, compact and precise, and when he taught her a thing, he taught it once, and expected her to carry it forward without being told again. The lesson she returned to most often in the days after the auction was the one he had given her about tight-fitting lids. A well-seated lid, he had said, is a letter written to the future. Whatever is inside was put there with intention. The seal is the intention made visible. Do not break a well-seated seal without knowing what the letter says. The trunk inside the freight car had a well-seated lid. She knew it was there before she opened the car. The manifest she had requested from the county clerk listed the car's original contents as declared by the Continental Overland Railway at the time of line abandonment in 1881. One steamer trunk, iron-banded oak, contents listed as company administrative records, sealed by order of Regional Superintendent W.H. Decker, Cheyenne Division. The manifest noted the seal date as October 14, 1881. No one had entered the car in the intervening 6 years because the car had been chained at both end doors with a company padlock, and the key was presumed to have departed with Decker or his assignees. Nora had grown up watching her father work iron hoops onto barrel staves. She was not a locksmith in the formal sense, but she understood the geometry of restraint, the way iron holds what it is shaped to hold and yields when the shaping is reversed. She had a cold chisel and a ball-peen hammer in the tool roll, and she had her father's patience. The padlock took her 40 minutes, working in the cold with the chisel angled against the shackle where the hardened steel was thinnest. Her hands ached by the end of it. The chain came off cleanly and fell in a rust-colored coil against the rail tie beneath the car's wheel. She walked the length of the spur line twice before she went back to her rented room that evening. The spur was 200 yards long, laid on packed gravel that had grown over with sage and wire grass until it looked less like a spur line than like a suggestion of one. The car sat at the end on wooden ties that had weathered but held. Someone, at some point, had painted the car number on the side door panel in white paint that had faded to the color of old bone. The number was still legible. She noted it. She had been noting things. The dissolution filing she had pulled from the county clerk listed the car by number. The manifest listed it by number. The tax auction notice listed it by number. 3 separate documents, each confirming the same piece of property, each confirming that no one had ever claimed it. What she found inside the car before she reached the trunk at all was a kind of stillness she had not anticipated. The air that came out when she pulled the door was cold and dry and carried the smell of iron and old oak and something faintly mineral, the smell of a place that had been sealed against weather long enough that its interior had become its own small climate. The afternoon light fell in at an angle through the open door and hit the far wall of the car, and in the beam she could see dust that had been sitting undisturbed for 6 years, beginning to move for the first time, lifted by the current of outside air coming in. She stood in the doorway a moment before stepping up. The floor of the car was clear of debris. Someone had swept it before sealing it. There was a single wooden crate against the near wall that proved, on inspection, to contain nothing but packing straw, from which whatever had been crated had long since been removed. A hook on the far wall held what had been a canvas cover, now stiff with cold and age, folded over itself into a shape that no longer matched any useful object. The car was, in almost every respect, empty. The trunk sat at the forward end of the car, iron-banded as the manifest described, oak staves darkened with age but intact. The lock a simple warded mechanism. She did not force it. She sat beside it in the cold interior and looked at it for a long time. And then she went back to her rented room and read the manifest again and the deed record and the dissolution filings she had requested from the county clerk. And she thought about what her father had said about well-seated lids. The next morning, she brought the manifest to a man named Reuben Poole, who was 71 years old and had been in Chalk Ford since before the Continental Overland had laid its first rail through the territory. Poole ran a small farrier operation at the south end of the settlement and had the unhurried manner of a man who had stopped being surprised by things some years back. Nora laid the manifest on his workbench and asked him what he knew about W.H. Decker. Poole set down his rasp and read the document without picking it up. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered whether he intended to answer. Decker was the division superintendent, he said at last. Ran the Cheyenne office for the Overland from about 77 until they folded. Word was he left under circumstances. She asked what kind of circumstances. The kind a railroad company does not put in its public filings, Poole said. He picked up the rasp again and then set it down again. There were families here who had water rights agreements with the Overland. The pumping station out on that spur was supposed to serve the west quarter of the settlement, dry side of the hill. 7 homestead families. They paid into the waterworks company the Overland set up, paid for years. Station never opened. Money was gone when the company folded, and the water rights those families had signed over to the Overland Waterworks Company were gone with it. Some of those families left. 1 or 2 held on. He looked at the manifest again. Administrative records, he said. Sealed by Decker. Yes, Nora said. Poole was quiet for another moment. Lena Marsh is still here, he said. Her father was one of the 7. She runs the laundry at the end of Pryor Street. You might talk to her before you open that trunk. What Lena Marsh told Nora over the course of 2 evenings filled in what Poole had outlined with the specific and irreplaceable weight of someone who had lived inside it. Lena ran the laundry on Pryor Street with an economy and precision that had the feel of someone who could not afford inefficiency. And when Nora came the first evening, she was still at her workboards, finishing a stack of linens by lamplight. She did not stop working while she talked. She had the hands of someone who had been doing physical work for 20 years, and the manner of someone who had spent a long time making accurate assessments of how much to trust a given situation. Her father, Clement Marsh, had paid $42 into the Waterworks Company in 3 installments between 1878 and 1880. He had signed a document transferring his water claim on the spring-fed draw to the Overland Waterworks Company of Wyoming in exchange for guaranteed delivery service once the pumping station was complete. The draw was not a large source, but it was reliable through August, which was the dry month, and on their parcel of land it was the difference between a working kitchen garden and a failed one. He had understood what he was signing over. He had signed it because the Overland's representative had been persuasive, and because the promised station would have delivered more water than the draw produced, and because in 1878 the Continental Overland Railway was a going concern with surveyors and engineers, and the particular authority of an institution that was building something. The station had never been completed. The money had been absorbed into the company's general accounts. When the company dissolved, a receiver had been appointed in Cheyenne, but by that time the waterworks accounts had been separated from the railway accounts, and the receiver's mandate covered only the railway assets. The waterworks money had simply ceased to exist in any ledger the court examined. Clement Marsh had died in 1884, still holding what Lena called, with the flat precision of someone who had stopped expecting remedy, a piece of paper saying he owned water he never got. She folded the last linen and set it on the stack. She was quiet for a moment. There were 7 families, she said. I know of 2 who are still here. The others went north or south or simply went. The dry side of that hill never did get reliable water. 2 of those families had that as a reason for leaving. She did not ask Nora what was in the trunk. She asked only whether, if there was something that might matter, Nora would tell her before she told anyone else. Nora said she would. It is worth pausing here to consider what it means to spend 3 days and the better part of 2 nights reading through the administrative records of a failed railroad division. Nora had the trunk opened by her third visit to the freight car, working the warded lock with a piece of bent iron wire she had shaped herself. Her father's lesson about patience applied to a mechanism rather than a hoop. She worked by feel as much as by sight, turning the wire slowly in the keyhole until she felt the first ward align, and then the second, the mechanism giving in two distinct stages, like a sentence with a pause in the middle. The lock was simple and gave without damage. She lifted it free and set it on the floor of the car beside her knee. The lid lifted on hinges that had not corroded through, owing to the dryness of the sealed interior. There was a brief resistance at the seam, the oilcloth weather seal her father would have recognized. And then the lid came free and the air inside the trunk reached her for the first time, dry and faintly sweet in the way of old paper stored without damp. The specific smell of documents that have been kept and not consulted for years. The records inside were bundled in oilskin, which had kept them from the worst of the cold's effect. There were 22 bundles, each tied with brown cord that had gone brittle at the knot. She counted them before she touched anything else. Then she untied the first bundle with the care she would have given an old cask ring, the kind that had been on so long that the iron had taken the shape of the wood it held and could not be removed without thought. She carried them to the freight car door in the flat gray light of a November afternoon and went through the first 3 bundles before the light failed. The first bundle was correspondence, internal memoranda from the Cheyenne Divisional Office, dated between 1877 and 1880, mostly routine. The second was construction ledgers for the pumping station, specific enough that she could track the project week by week through its first year of activity. The third was where she found the subscription accounts, 42 names in a clear clerk's hand, each with a dollar amount and a date and a receipt stub number. She borrowed a lamp from Poole and went back the following morning. Her father had run his cooperage with the ledger discipline of a man who understood that numbers were a form of honesty or a form of fraud and could not be both at once. He had taught her to read a ledger as she would read a letter, looking not only at what was said, but at what was absent from what should have been there. The Continental Overland Water Works Company accounts, bundled in Decker's administrative records, told a story that its author had apparently intended to bury in an unexamined freight car at the end of an unvisited spur line. The waterworks subscription accounts were present and complete through 1880. 42 families in the Chalk Ford district and the surrounding homestead country had paid into the fund over 3 years, a total she calculated at $2,308. The construction ledgers for the pumping station showed disbursements for materials and labor through 1879, then a gap, then a resumption of payments to a contractor in Cheyenne, whose name appeared in no other record she could find, then another gap, then a final entry in October 1881. The month Decker sealed the trunk, the final entry was not a disbursement. It was a transfer. $2,040 transferred to an account identified only by a number. On the same day, the trunk was sealed. There was no record of where the account resided or who held it. There was, however, a letter in the last bundle, written in a neat administrative hand on Continental Overland stationery, addressed to the company's board in New York, dated 1 week before the seal date. The letter reported that the waterworks project had encountered insurmountable geological difficulties and recommended winding down the subsidiary. It expressed regret for the inconvenience to subscribing homesteaders and proposed that any claims be handled through the general receiver's process. The letter was not signed. The draft copy was in the bundle because Decker, or whoever had written it, had apparently placed it there as a record of what had been sent. Whether it had actually been sent, there was no way to know. What Nora could know was that the waterworks accounts she held showed no geological survey, no engineering report, no record of any insurmountable difficulty. They showed a functioning fund, a half-built station, and a transfer of nearly all the remaining money to an unidentified account 1 week before the company was declared insolvent. She sat in the freight car doorway with the draft letter in her hands and the manifold light of a Wyoming November behind her. Pine ridges to the west, going dark in the afternoon. She had not set out to find this. She had set out to find steady work. But her father had also told her that a well-made thing does not stay hidden from the right hands indefinitely. And she understood, sitting at the edge of that 6-year silence, that the trunk had been waiting for someone who could read what was in it. She brought Lena Marsh to the freight car on the 4th day. She had organized the records by category, the subscription accounts with each family's name and payment amounts, the construction ledgers, the correspondence, and the final transfer entry, which she had copied out in her own hand onto a clean sheet so it could be read without handling the original. Lena stood in the freight car with the lamp between them and read each document Nora set before her in turn. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was level. $42, she said, not as a question. Listed here under your father's name, Nora said. 3 installments, 1878 through 1880. The receipts are here as well. She showed her the receipt stubs, which Decker had apparently been organized enough to retain even while arranging the disposal of the money they represented. $2,308, Lena said, reading Nora's summary. From 42 families. Yes. Lena set the copy down on the trunk. What does this mean? For what can be done? Nora had thought about this carefully. She was not a lawyer. She was not a land agent or a county official. She was a woman who could read a ledger and who owned, now that she thought about it, the only surviving administrative record of a fraud that had taken place 6 years ago in the formal darkness of corporate dissolution. The Continental Overland was gone. Decker was presumably somewhere in the east or the west, which was a large territory in which to look for a man who did not wish to be found. What remained, however, was the water right. Your father's deed, she said, the one you told me he kept, the one that said he owned water he never got. Lena said she had it. Her mother had kept it after Clement died, and Lena had it now in a tin box in her house. The waterworks company transferred that right from him, Nora said. But the transfer was made in exchange for a service the company was already in the process of not providing. The subscription accounts show the money was moved 6 weeks before the insolvency filing. If the company took the right and then transferred the subscription funds before the insolvency, the transfer of the right may not have been honored by a legitimate consideration. She said this carefully because she was uncertain of the precise legal framing and did not want to promise a remedy she could not deliver. What she was more certain about was that the records she held constituted a documented account of what had happened, and that a documented account was something a county court and a territorial land office could act on, even if the acting would take time. I want to take these records to the county clerk and the territorial land office in Cheyenne, she said. Not for myself. I own the freight car. I do not own what is in it. The records belong to the record of what was done. If you have spent time in a small settlement in the late years of the 19th century, you may know the particular way information moves in such a place, faster than the speed of deliberate communication and in directions no one plans. By the following morning, the settlement of Chalk Ford knew that Nora Vane had opened the freight car on the spur line. By midday, it knew there had been records inside. By the time the mercantile closed, it knew, in the general and imprecise way that settlements know things, that what she had found concerned the waterworks money. Webb said nothing to her when she came in to open up. He had the look of a man recalibrating something privately, and she let him recalibrate. He found work to do at the far end of the store that did not require him to look in her direction, and she found work to do at the near end that did not require her to speak to him. and the morning passed in this mutual arrangement. Two women came into the store before noon who were not regular customers. They bought small things, a spool of thread, a tin of salt, and both looked at Nora with the particular attention of people who have been told something and want to see whether it matches the person they are seeing. She gave them no reason to revise their accounts. She was restocking the dry goods shelf and did not pause. Cobble, the auctioneer, walked past the store window twice. He did not come in. Poole came to her rented room that evening with a covered dish from his wife and the information that a second family was still in the district whose name appeared in the subscription accounts. The Garvey family out on the East Homestead Road, 3 miles from the settlement proper. He had sent word to them that morning. He thought they would want to know. "You'll need someone to travel with you to Cheyenne," Poole said. "It's 4 days by wagon in November. I can't go, but my nephew can. He's steady and he knows the road." She thanked him and said she would let him know before the week was out. What she needed before Cheyenne was a complete inventory of the records in the trunk, cross-referenced against the subscription list, so that each family's claim could be documented individually. She spent 2 days doing this work at the freight car, in the cold, wearing her coat and the red shawl her mother had knitted for her the winter before her father died. The shawl the color of a certain grade of iron oxide, the color her father had called honest red, because you saw it on things that had worked hard and been out in weather. The wool was dense and did not let the Wyoming cold through easily, and she wore it pulled close while she worked. The inventory she produced was 23 pages in her own hand, each page organized by family name, subscription amount, receipt stub reference, and a notation of whether the family was believed to be still present in the district. She listed 42 families. Of these, Poole and Lena and the Garveys helped her account for 7, still in the Chalk Ford area, 6 whose last known addresses she recorded as best she could determine, and 29 whose current whereabouts she could not establish. The records themselves she wrapped back in the oilskin and placed in the trunk. The trunk was too large to transport by saddle, which meant the wagon was necessary, which meant Poole's nephew, whose name was Cole, was necessary. Cole was 23 and had the economy of speech and the practical efficiency that came from having grown up managing a working operation under a taciturn uncle. He inspected the trunk, agreed it could be loaded, and they left for Cheyenne on a Thursday morning with Poole's draft horse, a borrowed wagon, and the trunk in the wagon bed covered by canvas. It was 3.5 days to Cheyenne on the November road. The first day was cold and dry, the high desert country opening out to the east of Chalk Ford as the road descended from the pine ridges into the wider sage flats. The trunk rode in the wagon bed under the canvas and made no sound. Cole drove with the calm competence of someone who did not require conversation to feel useful, and Nora spent a portion of the first afternoon reviewing her 23-page inventory against the original subscription accounts, checking figures. She found one arithmetic error in her own tallying, corrected it, and confirmed the revised total at $2,308. They overnighted at a ranch staging stop the first night. The second day brought low cloud that did not break. The road ran through country that had the specific quality of land that had been ranched hard and was resting from it. The grass thin over red soil, occasional stone corrals standing without gates or stock. They passed one settlement, 5 buildings and a water tower, where a man at the well gave them the road condition ahead and looked at the canvas-covered trunk with the mild curiosity of someone who decided not to ask. On the second evening, when they had camped on the lee side of a rock formation out of the wind, Cole asked her what she thought would come of it. She was quiet long enough that he did not repeat the question. "The money is likely gone," she said. "The transfer account is 6 years old, and the man who made it has not been in this territory in 6 years. But the water rights are a different matter. A right transferred in exchange for a consideration that was never performed is a right that may not have transferred at all. The court decides that, not me. But the court needs the records to decide it. Cole looked at the fire. Those families gave up their water claims. They gave them up in exchange for something, she said. If the something never came, the exchange may not have been valid. That is a question for the land court in Cheyenne, and after that, the territorial court in Laramie if it needs to go that far. She did not say, I do not know if it will work. She did not say, the law in this territory has not always been kind to homestead families who have a piece of paper against a railroad's legal record. She said what she believed to be true, which was that the records were now documented and in the possession of people who intended to see them examined. Cole put another piece of wood on the fire. He did not say anything further. In the morning, he drove with the same care, the trunk steady in the wagon bed, the road dropping toward the valley where Cheyenne sat in its grid of new streets, and the smell of coal smoke reached them before the buildings did. The land office in Cheyenne received the records with the careful attention of a government office that understood it was being handed something complicated. The clerk, a methodical man named Hayes, who had been processing territorial land filings for 11 years, looked at the transfer entry and at the subscription accounts and at Nora's 23-page inventory for a long time before he said anything. When he did, it was to ask whether she had a copy of the original property purchase document for the freight car, meaning the tax auction receipt. She had it. She produced it from her coat. Haas looked at it, and then at the trunk, and then at her. You understand this will take time, he said. She said she understood. The waterworks records are now in the land office's possession, he said. That means they're part of the formal record. Any determination about the validity of the rights transfers will go through the territorial court. We can't promise an outcome. I am not asking for a promise, she said. I'm asking for the records to be in the right place. Haas made a note. He made several notes. He asked the names of the families she could still locate, and she gave him the list she had prepared, with Poole's name at the top as a contact in the settlement. She gave him the Garvey name and Lena Marsh's name, and the addresses she had established for the 6 families whose whereabouts she had been able to trace. Hayes recorded all of it with the attention of a man who intended to use what he was given. They left Cheyenne on a gray afternoon with an empty wagon bed. The territorial court process took 14 months. Nora knew this because she was still in Chalk Ford for all of it, having by that time established herself as something other than Webb's occasional stock help. She had, in the course of the winter that followed the Cheyenne trip, taken on 3-barrel repair commissions from the settlement's only tavern keeper, who had a problem with his cider stock and needed someone who understood what made a stave seal fail. The word had spread, as such words do in small places, and by spring she had enough coopering work to justify renting the back of the tanner's empty building on the South Road for a modest monthly sum. Webb, for his part, had said nothing about any of it. He had one morning, some weeks after the Cheyenne trip, found occasion to remark that the freight car on the spur looked less dilapidated than it had, which was as close as she expected him to come to any acknowledgement of what had happened. She had said that leaving the doors open allowed the interior to air out, which it needed after 6 years closed, and Webb had nodded as if this were the kind of practical remark that required no particular response, and that had been the extent of it between them. The cooperage work suited her in the same way her father's cooperage had suited him, which was to say that it left her alone with her hands and a material that rewarded attention. Stave wood had a grain you could read if you knew what you were looking for, and a barrel that was going to fail usually told you so in the making, if you were willing to listen. She had spent enough time in her father's shop as a child that her hands remembered the work before her mind had fully recalled it. the draw knife finding the angle of grain without her having to think about finding it. Poole's wife brought her a pie on the occasion of Nora's first independent order, a new barrel for the tavern rather than a repair. Poole himself shook her hand. It was a brief exchange. The territorial court's determination, when it came, was partial. The water rights for 4 of the 7 remaining district families, including Lena Marsh and the Garveys, were found to have been transferred under terms that the court ruled insufficiently supported by performance, which was the formal way of saying that taking a person's water right without providing the service you promised in exchange wasn't a valid transaction. The 4 rights were restored to the original family claims. The other 3 determinations were held for further proceedings, and 2 of those eventually resolved the same way in the 18 months that followed. Though Nora only knew of them through the report Poole gave her when he received word from Haz's office, the money was another matter. The transfer account was never recovered. The court made a finding that it had existed and noted its amount, which at least established a public record of what had happened. And the Territorial Attorney General's office opened an inquiry into Decker's whereabouts, which went east and produced, as far as Nora heard, no Decker but some inconvenience for a man who had worked for a successor railway company and who had, apparently, reason to prefer that certain records remain unexamined. The amount of inconvenience she never learned precisely. She did not follow the inquiry as closely as she followed the land court proceedings, and the Decker portion of the story resolved itself in the way that such things often do, not with a confrontation or a reckoning, but with a quiet rearrangement of circumstances in a city far from Chalk Ford. The morning the first land court determination came through on the Garvey's claim, Emmett Garvey came to the cooperage on the South Road. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in. He was a weathered man in his 50s with the specific quietness of someone who had been carrying a thing for a long time and had just set it down. "My father paid into that fund in 1878, he said, before I was old enough to understand what he was signing. He died thinking we lost it." She set down the draw knife she was using on a stave and looked at him. "The right is yours now," she said. "The court's order established it. You'll want to file the determination with the county clerk so it's in the local record." Garvey nodded. He stood there a moment longer as if he were still accounting for something. "I heard you bought that freight car for $3.50, he said. $3.50, she confirmed. He went out. She heard him on the South Road for a moment and then did not. The spring of 1889 came to Chalk Ford with the particular quality of a winter releasing its grip on a high desert settlement. The kind of cold-to-warm transition that happens faster than the land can accommodate it. Poole standing in the street, the air carrying the smell of thawed soil and the green shoots of the sage coming back. Nora had expanded the cooperage by then, taking on a second-hand lathe from a sale out of a closed operation to the north. The barrel repair work had given way to a modest but steady new barrel trade, serving the eastern ranches that found it impractical to haul cooperage up from Cheyenne. She had 3 regular accounts and the possibility of a 4th. Lena Marsh came to the cooperage on a Tuesday morning in late April. She stood for a moment in the doorway in the light that came through the south window, and then she crossed to where Nora was working and placed an envelope on the workbench. "The land court determination came final this week," she said. "The spring-fed draw is ours again. My father's name is on the claim record." Nora looked at the envelope. She did not open it. "He would have wanted you to know that," Lena said. Nora nodded. She picked up the draw knife again and ran it along the stave, the wood curling away in a clean, even ribbon. "There were 42 families," she said. "Not all of them are accounted for yet." "No," Lena said. "Not all of them." They stood in the cooperage with the sound of the lathe ticking and the light coming through the south window, and neither of them said what both of them understood. which was that the remainder of the work was not finished and might not be finished in any time they could easily name, and that this was the nature of the kind of writing that does not come all at once. It comes in filings and determinations and the slow accumulation of a public record that makes the buried thing visible to whoever comes to look at it. Outside, on the South Road, the settlement went about its business in the April morning. At the end of the spur line, the old freight car sat with its doors open, as Nora had left them. The trunk was gone. It was in the land office in Cheyenne, properly receipted, part of the record now. What the car held was the dry, still air of a Wyoming spring coming through those open doors for the first time in 8 years, and the particular quality of a sealed thing that had been opened by the right hands at the right moment. Her father's cold chisel hung on a nail above the cooperage bench, clean and precisely where she had placed it. If there is a story like this one, waiting in your own family's memory, one about something overlooked that turned out to matter, we would be glad to hear it in the comments below. And if this is the kind of story you return to in the evenings, there is another one waiting for you when you are ready. This account draws on the documented practices of late 19th century American frontier railroad administration and territorial land law. The specific individuals, settlement, and company are fictional, though the mechanisms of water rights fraud and corporate dissolution, through which homestead families lost valid claims, were a documented feature of Western land development in the period.